Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm just going to invite all of our guests now to join us on the screen. Ellen, Jessie, Aiden, Lee, and Anne, please do join us. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and welcome everyone to the second New Music USA webinar, which is presented in collaboration with the New York Mayor's Office of and Entertainment and their extended play series, which replaces the Music Month this year, and we've been really proud to be part of this. This event today is part of New Music USA's Amplifying Voices program, which was launched in 2019 to foster collaboration between orchestras and composers whose perspectives we want to hear more frequently in future programs of orchestral music. Over 30 orchestras and 8 composers have joined in with this 5-year program of co-commissions, repertoire sharing, and collaborative working. And I'm really excited to see that many of the Amplifying Voices participants are watching today's webinar, including some of the composers. So thank you for joining in alongside everyone else who's joined us today. And I noticed there are people coming from as far as Ukraine, Canada, and Brussels, as well as across the whole of the United States. So that's really exciting. I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions later in our webinar. I also want to thank Sphinx Venture Fund, the Sorel Organisation, ASCAP and Wise Music Trust for making this programme possible. And of course, I want to thank today's panellists. We're joined by 2 brilliant and very busy composers, Reid and Jessie Montgomery. So thank you for taking the time out to join us today. And we're also delighted to have with us Aiden Feldcamp and Lee Bynum, who represent the New York-based American Composers Orchestra and the Dream Unfinished Orchestra. So thank you both for being here. Together, we're going to be taking stock of who gets to compose orchestral music today, and we're going to be reflecting on the different ways in which we can transform opportunities for the next generation of music creators, bringing about much needed positive change. And before we get going with our discussion, I'd like to extend a really warm welcome to Commissioner Anne del Castillo, who's going to say a few words on behalf of the New York Mayor's Office of Media and Entertainment. So over to you, and thank you, Commissioner Castillo.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I am it's such a privilege and an honor to be here with all of you. It really is my pleasure to welcome everyone. You know, the Mayor's Office of Media and Entertainment is really proud to sponsor this important discussion as part of our New York Music Month extended play program. I want to thank Vanessa and the entire team at New Music USA for putting it together. And I also want to thank and acknowledge Shira Gans, who's my agency's Senior Executive Director of Policy and Programs, who's really been the architect of our music programming, New York Music Month, and now New York Music Month extended play, which has been no small feat to convert 1 month of programming into 6 months of programming. But we felt that it was really important because we know that the music community was particularly hit hard by the pandemic, and we wanted to make sure that we were able to provide an opportunity for all of you to convene and to gain access to information and resources to, 1, figure out how to navigate in the pandemic, and 2, come up, use the time to really think through strategies for the future. This discussion in particular is something that I'm very proud to support because it's a question that we ask every day. How do we make arts, culture, and entertainment more inclusive? This including a broad array of music genres is part of that, right? That was one of the wonderful things about having extended plays, that we could really have a variety of formats and genres and musicians participate. Because the kind of work we hear matters, and whose work we hear matters. And we're asking that question at a very important moment. I have to say, one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that it's really given us pause to think about how do we recover from this crisis in a way that brings a more equitable community, that creates more equity in the community, in the creative community. Just I don't often have an opportunity to speak to all of you. And so I did just want to give you all a sense of the work that my office does. The Mayor's Office of Media and Entertainment really began as the Film Commission and has since expanded to include support for all of New York City's creative sectors: film, theater, television, music publishing, advertising, digital content, and nightlife. Prior to COVID, those sectors represented 150 billion in economic activity for New York City and about 500,000 jobs. So when COVID hit, we went from cheerleader to crisis counselor overnight, working with the sectors that we support to understand where they were, what did they need, then reflecting that back to government to advocate for financial assistance, grants, and other kinds of supports. And then keeping the community informed about what kind of resources were available through our newsletter, website, and town calls. We also really focused on programming to support the creative community through the pandemic, such as New York Music Month Extended Play. We also did programs like Music for the Soul, where we employed musicians to do paid performances for frontline workers. We did Off-Broadway in the Boroughs pop-ups to bring some live performance back to our city streets so that people could remember what the experience of being in live performance, of experiencing live performance. And then supporting ongoing programs that continued, such as Jan Arts NYC back in January, which is the live performance festival here in New York. Some recently launched programs that we have, for example, Curtains Up NYC, is to help the live performance community get access to federal funding. And so if you fall into that category where you represent a venue, we encourage you, and you're a New York City institution, we encourage you to sign up for that program. Open Culture, to provide opportunities for live performance organizations and other arts and culture organizations to have ticketed events in New York City so that they could, in public spaces, so they could get revenue. And then just last week, we announced a Broadway vaccination site, which is, I think, the only one of its kind in the country, where workers in live performance, film and television have access to a dedicated site to get vaccinations. And we're doing that through the Actors Fund. And so if you haven't already gotten your vaccinations, we really encourage you to sign up for appointments through the Actors Fund and encourage your colleagues to do so as well. We continue to provide programs in workforce and industry development. I encourage you, there's a host of programs to learn about on our website at nyc.gov/MOME. I just want those of you who are here in New York to know that we really are here to serve you. The government is here to serve you. You're a critical part of what defines us as a global creative capital. I know this has not been an easy time, but what gives me hope is the people I work for, you, the creative community. You know, I'm blessed to be a born and bred New Yorker, surrounded by our music. I built a career in arts and entertainment, probably because I grew up in New York and knew that was an opportunity. And now I have the privilege of serving the creative community. So seeing you here, seeing the work that you've continued to do is so inspiring and gives me hope, because I know that creativity has led New York City through every crisis, and it's going to be the thing that leads us out of this one. And so I thank you for the opportunity to address all of you. Thank you for being here, and thank you for participating in this important discussion.
Thank you. Thank you for everything you're doing, Commissioner Castillo. And I also want to reiterate your thanks to Shira Gans for helping to set this up. So thank you. And we're very much looking forward to staying in touch.
Fantastic.
So let's get going with today's discussion. I'm really excited about this, but I just want to begin by giving you all a chance to introduce yourselves. So I think I'm gonna ask Ellen, if you don't mind starting. I always go for composers first. That's just, you know, part of our practice, I think. But Ellen, can you tell us a bit about who you are, what you do, and also how you first got involved with orchestral music, seeing as that's the topic of today's webinar?
Sure. Hi, my name is Ellen Reid. I'm a composer and sound artist. I love working in a variety of media, and I'm so thrilled to be in this discussion with you today. I also co-founded a program called Luna Composition Lab with Missy Mazzoli in partnership with the Kaufman Music Center. I grew up in East Tennessee, surrounded by music. Music's been a part of my life in a variety of ways. I split my time between New York and LA. And during the pandemic, I've created a sound walk, which is a work of public art that's free and open to the public. So That's me in a nutshell.
Brilliant. And Ellen, how did you first kind of get into orchestral music?
Yes, actually, Andrew Norman heard some of my work. I was involved in Hopscotch, which was an opera production with Yuval Sharon. And Andrew advocated for me to be a composer with the LA Chamber Orchestra. And that was the first orchestral piece I wrote, and that was just a few years ago.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Jessie, tell us a little bit about your story.
Hello, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here and be participating in this conversation today. Thank you, Vanessa. So I also was born and raised like Commissioner Castillo. I was also born and raised in New York City and currently reside in New York. And I first got involved with orchestral music with a commission by the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra. They were at one point in partnership with the Sphinx organization. Through Sphinx, I did one of my first chamber, string orchestra chamber pieces, and sort of and then I believe sort of via channels where they were sort of creating partnerships at that time. I was invited to write something for larger and chamber orchestra with mixed winds and percussion. And so that was sort of the first time I had a go at that. That was 2016, I think. And then, so that was, so it was a chamber orchestra setting. So without conductors. The conductor came next with David Allen Miller and Albany Symphony shortly after that. Yes, and I am now recently been appointed to be the composer in residence with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. So that's going to offer a lot of new opportunities within orchestra, and also sort of bridging connections, and sort of in the way that I guess we'll get into in our discussion today, connections between composers and the orchestra. So.
Absolutely. And a couple of footnotes just for Ellen and Jessie. Firstly, I definitely recommend doing the sound walk in Central Park. Apparently also in LA, but I've done the one in Central Park and it's fantastic. And it does feature players from the New York Philharmonic. So that's kind of relevant to today's discussion. And, Jessie, I love the fact we have these shared connections with the Sphinx organization. I know that you've done a lot of work with them and also had residencies with their virtuosi, I think. So correct. All of that is going to be really relevant to today's discussion, I think. Mm-hmm. And congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Brilliant. Aiden, do you want to go next and just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm Aiden Feldcamp. I'm the Director of Emerging Composers and Diversity with the American Composers Orchestra. I know it's a long title, but basically comes down to I run the emerging composers opportunities that ACO provides. And a big part of that is our earshot readings. So we usually do 4 readings a season. 3 of them will be with partner orchestras all around the country. And then the 4th one will be with ACO in New York City. And that's just so exciting because not only do I get to work with all different orchestras across the country, but all different composers who are writing for orchestra. My first orchestral experience got to go way, way back. I accidentally ended up at an orchestral concert at 4 years old. And the story goes, someone was sick. They're like, oh, we'll just, bring the kid, whatever. But I got obsessed with orchestral music after that. Apparently wouldn't leave my parents alone until they got me a cello to saw away on. And I've just been playing cello ever since. So my orchestra experiences are definitely from the inside, and now helping to create more of it. It's really exciting.
Brilliant. So the lesson to that story is please everyone accidentally take a 4-year-old to an orchestral concert, I think. That's quite a strange concept, but it obviously worked. Lee, last but not least, could you introduce yourself to our viewers?
Good evening, everyone. It's a huge pleasure to be here. My name is Lee Bynum, and since October 2020, I've had the pleasure of serving as the inaugural Vice President for Impact at Minnesota Opera, where I lead the company's inclusion, diversity, equity, and access efforts, community engagement initiatives, and educational programming. In addition, I'm the board chairperson of the Dream Unfinished, a New York-based activist orchestra whose mission is to use classical music as a platform to engage audiences in dialogue surrounding social and racial justice. And prior to this, I was at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, where I had the opportunity to fund similar work. Beginning when I was 8, I grew up splitting my time between orchestra, I'm a flautist by training, theater, and dance. And while I was an undergrad at Columbia, I became very interested in producing and composing. And I've managed to stay in that space in the intervening years. So thank you for having me today. I'm very excited to be here.
Thank you for being here, Lee. So I think we're going to start by just taking a moment to address the first part of our question, which is who gets to compose for orchestra. And Aiden, I'm going to ask you to share the research that you actually told me about when we were preparing for this webinar, because I know you've got some statistics that you thought would be an important starting point for us before we get into really thinking about the positive and proactive things we can do to address them. So the floor's yours, Aiden.
Thank you so much. So through ACO, we did a survey back in 2019 to see who's writing for orchestra, who wants to write for orchestra but doesn't have the opportunity to, and who's being paid to write for orchestra. So through our research, we found that the majority of paid orchestral commissions go to white cisgender men, which is probably not a surprise to anyone. But looking at the numbers, this is the way it goes. So cisgender men are twice as likely to be paid for orchestra than cisgender women. But once cisgender women are given their first orchestral commission, that gap actually decreases in a huge way. So that's exciting to think about. If we're looking at cisgender and transgender composers, cisgender composers, either male or female, are 20 times more likely to be given a paid commission than their transgender and non-binary peers. We don't have enough data to know if one paid commission changes that gap or not, but that's something that we're continuing work on, and it's something to continue to think about. When we look at racial and ethnic diversity, we find that white composers are 6 or 7 times more likely to be paid for orchestra than their Black counterparts. And they're 16 times more likely to be paid than their Indigenous counterparts. So again, these are things that it's a wide gap. So it's something that we should start thinking about and putting systems in place to start closing those gaps up.
Thank you, Aiden. I mean, I know that many of us are not necessarily surprised by those statistics, but they're things that we want to change, and that's why Amplifying Voices exists, and that's why I know many of you are engaged in different ways in looking at how we can change the future for the next generation of both audiences, but also players and composers and artists. So I want to hear a bit from each of you about some of the, the approaches you've taken. Lee, the Dream Unfinished Orchestra, I know one of the things you talk about is reflecting the diversity of the orchestra's home city, which is New York. How are you achieving that, and how are you approaching some of these gaps and opportunities that we just heard about?
Sure. Thank you for that question, Vanessa. And if it's okay, I'll try to touch on what the Dream Unfinished does, but answer really broadly, because the Dream Unfinished is in a really special position, given that we are almost entirely an orchestra of people of color. So it's a slightly different configuration that we're dealing with. But I would say generally there are 3 things presenting organizations can do to address inequities. First, have a diverse representation within the group that decides what gets produced. The broader the representation of perspectives, the greater the organizational capacity to identify and circumvent blind spots. Second, establish and maintain substantive reciprocal relationships with community groups, as this can be a means of just reframing with whom you're in conversation about the music you're producing. And third, be intentional about developing a bench. Engage with organizations that nurture the talent of underrepresented composers. And these may include fellowship or residency programs, or even minority serving colleges and universities, or community music schools. A lot of these things are techniques that not only have worked for the Dream Unfinished, but are also bearing some really great fruit for us at Minnesota Opera.
And Lee, just very specifically, when we think about the composers you work with, how do you go about finding and selecting the people that write music for you?
Sure. A lot of it really does come down through personal networks, right? And I think what's really important about the Dream Unfinished is that we do have a very broad group of individuals around the table that contribute to the work that we produce, right? So we have conversations around themes that are of interest to us, usually themes in social or racial justice. And from there, we move towards composers who are already working in those spaces or whom we know to be people who feel strongly about certain issues and try to bring the racial justice pieces in next to the artistic pieces so that we are nurturing not only the composer's interest in writing really great music, but also in nurturing her, his, or their interest in the social issues as well.
Thank you, Lee. I want to move to Jessie next, actually, because I read in your biography, Jessie, that you are very passionate about not just composing, but education, advocacy. You're an artist, so you kind of see your life as straddling those four areas. So can you share some of your thoughts on how we can use advocacy, or what your approach would be to giving a broader range of people access to orchestral music, and particularly thinking about, you know, aspiring composers too?
Sure. So what I think about when I think about, you know, how can I'm thinking about how can I provide and look at the sort of benchmarks and the milestones and the opportunities that came along my path, and sort of see where, you know, using, you know, the different platforms and different associations I have, how can I provide those similar kinds of opportunities. These were like, you know, these were always sort of extension programs associated with major arts institutions. These were extension, you know, they're what we, you know, call them the outreach education programs that would provide really specific opportunities for, you know, select students, right, from community organizations. I went to Third Street Music School in New York for my music school, my pre-college. And so they would, you know, scout students from these programs and bring them in for specialized mentorship opportunities. And so that's an approach that I'm going to be looking at, which is, you know, especially within my work with Chicago, since that's such a large platform in which to do it. But the ways in which I can even, you know, Ellen, I'll be giving you some phone calls, you and Missy, some phone calls about the work you're doing with Luna Lab, and certainly within the Sphinx organization, which of course many of us, we all very familiar with their work, hopefully, and within the Sphinx organization, I've always sort of, we have this there's the wonderful summer program for high school students, and so I'm always sort of, I'm always keeping my eye out for, you know, those kids that are secret composers. That's always a, you know, that can be an aided. I think you know what I mean with that too, right? It's like you learn, you're playing an instrument, you're excelling and doing your instrument, and on the side you're composing. You haven't discussed it with your teacher yet, but you have these little pieces that you're working on. So I'm always sort of looking out for those kinds of young people, those kinds of the secret composers, and just I'll be, again, trying to find ways, you know, that I can give my own time to mentoring, and I am really going to be, I'm going to spend a good amount of time on that sort of, that age group, that high school to early college group of young, you know, artists that are looking for what to do and how to do it. But as we get along, you know, the logistics around sort of finding a way for those things to happen can become complicated within the institution of orchestral institutions and how large they are. but that's something I'm gonna be looking for. And I'll just add also, like Aiden, at one point, the American Composers Orchestra internship that I did at one point wasn't that was an incredible opportunity too, just to sort of be around a bunch of composers, look for opportunities that are that also put people in places within our community of musicians, just to have that interaction and that access to the world of it and how it works. The big machine of the orchestra it's a really important step for understanding, how you might actually interact with such an organization. So.
Sure, and I suppose it's so important to remember that your own position as a composer means that you're kind of serving as an inspiration and role model for the younger people, particularly the secret composers that you're trying to encourage. And one thing that also occurs to me is, some of your pieces have now been played, I think, more than 100 times, which is really, unique and incredible for a living composer. It's what we expect of dead white male composers, but not necessarily living composers. And I'm just thinking about, just in this conversation, how important that is. And I know you're part of a big group of co-commissioning orchestras through Amplifying Voices, which means that new piece, when it comes, will get about 8 performances straight up. So what's that experience like as a composer, just knowing that your music can actually be heard by so many people?
Well, I mean, it's an incredible surprise. And well, aside from like anxiety, it's it's a tremendous, I know it is it's a unique opportunity. And so I have to say, I'm one of the reasons for that, I think, is there's a lot of behind the scenes going on. There's I have structures in place that sort of make it so that my music can be accessible from many different angles. And so I think that that's something that's a whole long discussion about sort of the business of music and sort of how to navigate that. But it's an incredible thing. And so what I really am trying to figure out is like, I'm also trying to figure out how, what the actual sort of order of operations is there, and how to, get that if that's what, is really the desired outcome, is to have all of those performances happening. There are sort of business plan things that can happen in terms of the way that people access music, who gets to access it. And of course, with the internet and sort of the way that, the access people have, now is tremendous. And so, an orchestra in Denmark can know about, what's going on in American music really easily, and create different programming there. So, it's a whole, again, business. We'll do a business of music thing at some point, but writing, having a short, sweet piece that can fill a program is like a good thing to have. It was sort of accidental, but that's sort of how it ended up serving me in a way.
Of course, and now we've got obviously orchestras working together more, which I think
exactly, this is this consortium model is an incredible is what's really, I think, gonna help with that. I mean, that's the strongest thing, is everyone vying in and putting their faith in the process of bringing in new music. I mean, that seems like a new thing. I don't know if anyone else wants to speak to that, but that seems like a really recent development within the orchestral community, that so many people would jump on to new work.
Absolutely. And I think we're going to come to that a bit later, because I think collective action, whether you're a composer or orchestra, is what really brings about kind of sustainable change. So I think that's a really good point. I mean, there's certainly some collaboration, Ellen, at the heart of Luna, which Jessie mentioned, which I think it'd be great for you to kind of share some stories about. Because obviously, I think there were 3 composers who founded that together, you and others, and various institutions have been involved, but you were tackling a very particular aspect of Aiden's landscape that he told us about.
Yeah, Missy Mazzoli and I founded Luna Composition Lab to address the gender imbalance in music that Aiden was talking about. And, it's been so meaningful. We started with 3 fellows, and they were from New York City. It was a test year, and Rena Esmail, Missy Mazzoli, and I were the mentors. And then we've been able to grow over the past 5 years to have 6 fellows from all over the US. And, we look to make sure that we're representing a wide range of fellows, that we have people who are coming from places like New York and LA, where there are incredible educational opportunities for them already, and also from places like East Tennessee, where I'm from, where you just don't have, the LA Phil or, the Kaufman Music Center running these incredible programs. So I think through Luna Lab, we're looking at the pipeline, obviously, and trying to address it. And our fellows have gotten into incredible colleges. And we're also looking at the future. And it's amazing whenever their work is performed, how blown away the audience is by the caliber of the work. I think that's one thing that has been really meaningful. We just did a partnership with the Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra, where they performed the works of Luna Lab. And if you're a composer, you know what a big deal that is, because, that is a major statement. And that some of these fellows can apply to colleges and have that as part of their portfolios will help their careers grow. So I think that you can't always do everything, but by having a focused mission, there is a way to move the needle in some directions, both in the present and towards the future. And who knows what these fellows will be able to do, because they have so much more possibility because of the movement the space we've been able to make for them already.
And I think it's so valuable that obviously you're calling out in a very direct way to people who might not otherwise put themselves forward. Then you're giving them the opportunity to actually write music, and you're supporting them so they don't kind of fall down in the process of what is, I imagine, quite an overwhelming opportunity when you're first embarking on that. So I think that's really an amazing combination of support. Aiden, with ACO, Earshot's been around for a long time, helping composers with their first experience of writing for orchestra. I mean, do you want to talk a bit more about how you're now, and have been for several years, kind of responding to some of the, the challenges that you were highlighting?
For sure. So barriers to entry, that create the disparities that we're seeing, I mean, they're systemic. So organizations really need to begin to change at the systemic level. So a few things that ACO has done, especially in terms of Earshot, is the first thing is just taking inventory of the program. Whose work is being played the most? Who's being amplified? Who's being left out? What do those numbers actually look like? And once you've identified that, it's about creating specific and robust opportunities for people, and also finding where those barriers are, and doing what you can to eliminate them, to mitigate them. Something that was really, really helpful as we were thinking about changing the dynamics and the demographics of our application pool was active recruitment. So there's an amazing book called Invitation to the Party by Donna Walker-Kuhn, and she is a DEI consultant. She's worked in Broadway and in the arts for longer than I've been alive, basically. And she talks about it in this way, that your concert or your call for scores or whatever you're creating is a party. And so first you need to prepare your house for the party. So in other words, you need to create an environment that is inclusive and that is inviting and that people want to come to, regardless of their demographic. And then second, you need to send out the invitations. People aren't going to know about the party unless you send out the invitations. And so to me, this means doing a lot of internal work in your organization to create inclusion, to change things systemically, to look at your processes and say, how can this be more inclusive? And then it's about active recruitment. So finding people in places and through your network that you have not spoken to before. So for every Earshot call for scores, I'll have a list of 80 new people to reach out to individually by email to invite to apply to Earshot, and they're all from underrepresented demographics. And of course, that spans the gambit. It's not just about racial and gender equity. It's also about a disability equity. It's about, are they coming from another country? Do they have a visa? That kind of thing. So there's a lot of ways to be underrepresented in orchestral music, and we need to make sure that we're trying to cover everything. But I do think it's about, taking inventory of yourself and then reaching out.
Thanks, Aiden. I want to pick up on one of the points you kind of touched on, which is change at systemic level. And I want to kind of take us into thinking about ways of working. And one thing that's central to Amplifying Voices, and also I think some of the initiatives you've talked about, is remembering that composers are whole human beings. They might be brilliant at writing music, but they'll probably have lots of other brilliant things they can bring to the table. And so how do organizations, institutions form those holistic ways of seeing that person and their role? And I was thinking, Ellen, I know you've been a creative advisor and composer in residence at LACO at Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra. So I'm interested to hear from you. I mean, just in that example, for example, how important is it to be heard as a curator as much as a composer?
Yeah, my work with LACO is so meaningful to me. Definitely important to be heard as a curator as well as a composer. I had written a piece for LACO, and that's how I got to know them, and they reached out for me to take on this role. And I was really surprised because I was coming from a world that was more theatrically based. I had scored plays and written operas and film, and I was like, are you sure do you want this? And they said, yeah, we want someone to come in and really help us think outside the box. And that made me feel really seen, where sometimes I think as someone who's underrepresented, if you get asked for an opportunity that feels weird, you feel like somebody's just checking a box. But my relationship with LACO has been, so fruitful, and I think the work we're doing is really important. We talk every month about curation, about ways to grow. They've been involved with Luna Lab, and they're involved with Amplifying Voices, and we are trying to talk about how to get down to a cellular level and make the whole organization more equitable on every level, and their game, which is great.
Fantastic. And for the orchestras or institutions that are listening to this call, and this could be for Ellen or Jessie, because I know Jessie, in the Chicago residency, you also get to curate music now. I think some institutions are nervous about asking too much of people, and they may not want you to think that they're depending on you to help them discover, for example, other female composers or other underrepresented composers. But what would your message be to them if they had that hesitation? Jessie, do you want to answer that question?
Well, I personally happen to be personally interested in that very thing. And so I think it sort of aligns really well with my interests in this particular case. I kind of feel pretty opinionated about this, actually, realizing like I think that that's sort of part of the deal, like part of the gig. I mean, it should, it's expected, I think, that this is it's an opportunity for the organization to have access to our networks as composers, and how we choose to sort of work within our network in connection with the organization is sort of what what it means, I think, to be in that kind of partnership. So I think, you know, beyond that is where it gets tricky for me, in terms of, you know, how it, depending on the person, whether they're aligned. A lot of the, you know, there's historically, you know, there's also the other model, like where, you know, artists are brought in and then automatically expected to engage with the education department, or, you know, create some kind of extension, you know, that doesn't have a formal, like, sort of like artistic faculty membership title or something. Anyway, so I think, you know, once you start stacking on beyond, you know, what curating really means, what does curating mean? It means, you know, bringing in performances and bringing in artists, and bringing new things to the table. So I think I think it's like, or, you know, as long as it's all sort of within the artistic sphere, that's, I would say, what would be expected, and what particularly makes it exciting.
Yeah, I'm really excited by that idea. I mean, obviously seeing what program you come up with in Chicago, and also the kind of programming ideas that all of the Amplifying Voices composers kind of throw in with their orchestras, I think that's going to be great to see across the country. Lee, I want to bring you in as well. I mean, just talking, it sounds like your methodology and the DNA of the Dream Unfinished is so much about inclusive ways of working and thinking very carefully about how to, you know, create that sense of belonging. Is there anything else you want to add to what you've heard on that subject?
Yeah, thank you for that. There are two pieces that I think can be useful, depending on the size and the resources of your organization. One, invest robustly in an individual composer's career. Make a plan to support their development and engage that person regularly. It will give you a means of establishing a relationship where they can grow with your organization and over time contribute thoughtfully and fulsomely to that organization, which will have fostered their career, and that will be the association they have. And then secondly, you could make a strategic commitment to support the development of a cohort of composers, right? You can approach this geographically or relative to an interest group or something else thematic, whereby organizational resources are not only being used to buttress that artistic development, but also the space is being made at the organization itself to accommodate the broader exercising of that person's range of interests.
Thank you, Lee. I think that's really wise advice. And it kind of takes us back a little bit to the point we were discussing with Jessie at the beginning about thinking more broadly, not just about one individual or one isolated experience for that individual. It's like, you know, there's a cohort of people going through the same process, or maybe there's a network of orchestras all trying to do the same thing. So before we jump into the many questions that are coming in the chat, is there anything any of you want to contribute when we're talking about kind of collective action? Have you seen any really strong examples of that? Is there anything we could do to kind of move beyond lots of one-off nice things happening, but the whole system not changing?
I think orchestras committing to long-term, committing to women composers long-term, or people of color composers long-term, and not just when it's in the news cycle, would be excellent. You know, saying forever we're going to have this many women on the program, because it feels sometimes like the progress is just because of what's happening around us, and that the rubber band will snap back any second. And so I think that when we're in these moments where we're desiring to grow and to change, we have to commit to that growth forever. And there are programs that support that kind of commitment, but I think that would be that's what I recommend.
Thank you, Ellen. And I think obviously that's that whole point about long-term vision and continuing to do the work is what we're all talking about outside of the music world in relation to, you know, what's going on in the world around us at the moment. So I think that's a really good point. I'm going to start throwing in some questions because we've got lots of interesting things coming up in the chat. I think one of the questions for Ellen and Jessie was, it's now gone off up the screen, but it's to do with how you found or decided on the mentors that you had at important stages in your career. Because obviously, you know, some mentors are not always the right match for you. So how did you make sure that you found a mentor that worked for you? Jessie, have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, in some cases it's like, you know, accidental, and in some cases like, right. But I think, well, one very happy accidental mentor who's incredibly supportive at the beginning was, and still, Derek Vermel. He knew my dad, who ran a music studio. He used to rent studio space from him, and my dad said, "Hey, you like composing? You should go meet with Derek." And so, you know, Derek was also had this sort of like, I'm a New Yorker, I'm really laid back about being a composer. He seems pretty late, you know. I don't know if maybe, you know, maybe there's another layer, but I mean, he always seemed like this was like a really like good existence, you know. And so I thought, well, okay, that makes sense to me. So I sort of, you know, fell into orbit with him for a long time. And then Laura Kaminsky as well has just been an incredible guide. And I, you know, in terms of like, I mean, I think I was drawn to her in particular because of her, she has always sort of held a firm position as a faculty member, and also has this very, and also has this, she just was also, she was always connected with some arts organization. And I thought that so having that model in place and sort of like seeing that at a certain point early on was important for me to recognize. I think that was a potential way to like have a leadership role, but also sort of maintain connection to the community as well, to the larger composer community.
Excellent. Thank you for those examples and those tips, Jessie. I'm going to keep reading out questions. This one's more for Aiden and Lee, I think. It's from Alexander Sanger, who's here, and he's asking, networks can be great, but also incestuous. I'd like to hear thoughts on how to get artistic or music directors to get out of their comfort zone and hear new music by new composers. Do you have any ideas about that? He's wondering whether a website to collect available composers and their work that's then made accessible to decision makers could be useful. So that's, Aiden, you're nodding your head a lot. Do you want to answer to that?
I'll say something quickly. So a lot of this kind of work is what I'm doing when it comes to like recruiting for Earshot. It's like trying to find people outside of our normal networks, outside of the average schools that we look at. Like Earshot, before I started doing some recruitment, was mostly coming from the same large conservatories, and that makes sense. You know, it's a very natural like pathway for a composer to walk. But I'm like super interested in people that are going to schools outside of that system, or people that maybe didn't even go to school for music, but are composers, or they've been out of school for a while. So like, where are those places that you can start looking into? In terms of a website, I know there's lots of directories and databases out there, and there's nothing like that's super cohesive. It's kind of like you're looking in a lot of different places to kind of get stuff together, and it is, you know, work. But I mean, Sphinx has an amazing database that I've used often to learn about new composers, and there's of course the Institute of Composer Diversity, which starts you off on your like journey of finding new people. But when it comes down to it, it's kind of just like asking around, but then also doing a lot of research. And I think this is something that we as an orchestral world can do better, is to try to create a hub for this information to live in. Because I don't know, I could be wrong, but I don't know that it exists right now.
I think you're right. I don't think it does. Maybe in some different places. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that, Lee?
I think in the absence of those kinds of resources, which are hard to keep up to date for obvious reasons, right? Every day someone is writing something new, and there are new composers coming out of schools every single day. I think what organizations need to do is have diversity in the ranks of the decision makers, right? And it's not just about ethnic or gender diversity, it's about diversity of thought. You know, I'm glad that Aiden brought up the idea of not all of us in the space come out of the conservatory space, right? Or not every person who has strong informed perspectives about orchestral music are themselves coming out of an orchestral space, right? So I think having some broadness there and recognizing, you look around your table, notice who's missing, right? Notice which perspectives you don't have, and then do the work of seeking them out, because I don't think that there's any way around this except to do the work of finding out who's writing music and how it appeals to the audiences that you represent.
I think that's a really great point. And I'm not sure that it should be somebody else's responsibility to create the all singing, all dancing website that tells us about all the composers we haven't discovered. I think really that is part of a curator's role, but I think it is that maybe it's more a kind of, a guidebook equivalent to the book you mentioned, Invitation to the Party, but on a slightly different subject, which is what are the mechanisms, what are the mindsets, what are the different ways in which we need to really open ourselves out so we don't just fall into kind of traditional existing patterns. I have got a question that's kind of related to some of that, which is from Graham, who's asking how important it is to have a degree in college for composers getting commissions or opportunities with orchestras. Any thoughts?
I would say traditionally, those with conservatory training, it was an easier path for them to get into orchestral writing. I would like to think that that is changing, and I would hope that that is changing. I think if you're going through conservatory and that's what's best for you and that's what you like to do and that's what you can do, I think you should. Like, I'm not saying that that's any like better or worse than any other path. I just think that there are many ways to get to writing to orchestra, and I hope that orchestral programmers are open to that. And they are, there are definitely stories like this, and it's not unknown, but I think it's something that we should start moving toward, and it's something that maybe hasn't been traditionally true.
Thank you, Aiden. Jessie.
I just wanted to add, it just made me think of an idea, it's when it comes to having that interest, and it's about experiences, right? Finding those experiences to write for orchestra. So, if there's a way for orchestras to be thinking about the workshopping that goes in for a young composer that's trying to figure out how to engage with the orchestra, to find resources that allow that person to have access to the symphony in some way, even in the workshop setting, that's short, that's brief, but creates this opening, and this can feed the curiosity and hopefully draw out something from someone who's wanting to do that.
Thank you, Jessie. There's another really great question. How can we as an industry better help conductors, soloists, and management to be champions of new music and diverse composers? And that's coming from Eric at Detroit Symphony Orchestra, who's part of our Amplifying Voices program. Do you have a thought on that, Ellen, as a composer, how we can get conductors, soloists, and managements to champion, first of all, new music in general, because I think we know that only 16% of orchestral program is made up of new music, but then also those people championing composers too, so that we're not only pointing our fingers to the orchestras, it's about people working around them.
Yeah, I think, having a place like Detroit hire conductors that think outside the box. I think that making sure that on all these different levels, we have people who see music in different ways, as Lee's been talking about this whole time, this diversity of thought as well as representation. I think that all of the people who are on this webinar can think about that and find people who are conductors who champion new music, or if there's a conductor who is really well established, like, can you slide in that Jessie Montgomery piece to the program, and all of a sudden they might just fall in love. You never know what's going to be the tipping point for anyone.
Anyone else want to add to that response?
I would just add really quickly, sort of a regular level of exposure to new music, to different composers, right? Like actually being strategic about it and being intentional around identifying people who you would like to share with those in your immediate network who are decision makers, right? Who are the people who are in these gatekeeping functions. I take part of my role at Minnesota Opera coming in to share with our artistic director, our general director, the work of people who I know, who I appreciate, right? Who I think should be heard. When I was in college, I was actually in Captain My Captain that Ellen wrote. It was like the very last thing I did before graduation. And when I saw last year or 2 years ago, Prism, like it stood out to me as something to share with my immediate network, right? It was a very informal thing, but it's the kind of thing that all of a sudden it shifts conversations. And the field isn't so large that you can't take what may feel like something incredibly incremental and then see a huge sea change over time because someone has been made familiar with someone that they were not familiar with before. Thank you for casting me, Ellen. It was a great experience.
I love it when these webinars bring those connections to life. I was just also going to mention, we haven't talked about the audience, but of course, one way of encouraging, whether a conductor or an artist, you know, or people within the industry to champion new music and composers is that ultimately it makes the music that's being performed relevant to more people, particularly if you're representing people who haven't had the chance to be seen or heard in a concert hall before. So I think it's all about generally increasing the quality of the music programming and its relevance. So that's something I'm always wanting to remind ourselves of when we have these conversations. We're kind of a bit over time, so I'm going to get to our final question, which is one that I always love, which is our music question. So given that this discussion has been about you know, thinking about how we can shift opportunities for future generations and think about a different canon of orchestral music for the next century. I just thought it'd be great to get each of you to share one piece of orchestral music by a composer that today's audience may not be familiar with. So I'm going to ask someone to volunteer to go first. Who would like to go first on that one? Aiden.
Yes, I'd like to share Alex Temple's 3 Principles of Noir, which is a piece for chamber orchestra and vocalist. I love this piece so much. It has time travel, the 1893 World's Fair, stolen research, a historian. It's so funny. It's so exciting. And it's such a piece. She writes incredibly well for orchestra. And I'm really just hoping she has more opportunities to write more orchestral works. So we can come and hear them.
Excellent. And we're going to make sure we put this list up on social media afterwards. So Lee, would you like to go next?
John 3:16 by Jasmine Ariel Barnes is a piece that I'm sort of over the moon about. I love her work more generally, but I would encourage everyone to listen to that.
Thank you, Lee. Ellen?
Sure. Promises, it's a new album by Pharoah Sanders, Floating Points, the London Symphony Orchestra. It's mind-blowingly beautiful. It moves seamlessly between jazz, electronic music, and symphonic writing. It's brilliant.
Thank you, Ellen. I actually funded Floating Points in my previous job in his very first opportunity.
Thank you.
Well, he was trying to develop his orchestration skills, actually. So hopefully it fed into that recording. So yeah, it's a brilliant piece. Thank you for that. And Jessie, how about you to round things off?
The piece that's been going in my head recently is this piece by Cassandra Miller, duo for cello and orchestra, which is just an incredibly hypnotic piece that it has this like, it's basically a canon that evolves over 30 minutes, which is an incredible piece. I think everyone here should take a listen. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We're coming up to 6:10. I want to make sure we wrap things up now. So I just want to say huge thanks to our panelists and for that incredibly rich discussion. We could have gone on for another hour, I think, but that was brilliant. And we'll be making sure that this is available as a recording for other people to tune in as well. So thank you, Ellen, Aiden, Lee, and Jessie. Really appreciate your time. Also, thanks to the Mayor's Office of Media Entertainment and Commissioner Castillo, the Sphinx organisation, the Sorrel organisation, I know you're here, ASCAP as well, and Wise Music Trust. And most importantly, thank you to everyone who's tuned in today and all the amazing questions. They were really great questions, so I really appreciate that. And I'm sorry we didn't get to every single one, but we'll find a way to do that another time. And for anyone who wants to find out more about Amplifying Voices or the various initiatives we're running at New Music USA, newmusicusa.org is our website. So please tune in and see you again sometime soon. Have a really nice evening, everyone. And thank you again. Bye.